Hello, hello, can we gather again, please? Hello, yoo-hoo. I used to be able to whistle through my teeth. What? That was a terrific talk.
Oh, thank you. Thank
I
you.
have no idea all that stuff I did on Descartes once really was all about that if.
Yes.
All about that as if. I could have gone that way. I didn't know.
Yeah, they're all being good. That's good. Basically,
Okay, so welcome back. I'm glad there's a lot of us here for discussion and questions. Moritz Ingerwesen, who's a third-year doctoral student, is going to ask the questions, and it's going to be the moderator for the questions.
We'll have a good conversation.
He's going to ask them all, but of course, knowing Moritz, we'd like him to ask all the questions, so that's all right. So Moritz is. I just want to tell you something very briefly about Moritz. Moritz is coming to us from Germany, from Cologne, where he has a kind of a bi-relationship with us here at Trent and with American Studies, or whatever the version of American Studies is, in Cologne, in Germany, at the University of Cologne. And in fact, he's our first what's called Co-12 student, doctoral student between Germany, Cologne, and Trent. And he came to Peterborough, to Cultural Studies doctoral program, in fact, to study with Veronica Hollinger in science fiction studies. And David Holsworth, yes, he's gone. And David Holsworth, but David Holsworth is a very important mediator, and it kind of speaks to the background of Moritz, where he did his gymnasium work and his post gymnasium work, in fact, as a physicist. And somehow, in the way that our speaker has talked about, somehow he crossed this line between physics and science fiction. He kind of crossed over this as-if barrier, and all his presentations with us have always been sort of skating back and forth across that line. And so I just wanted to mention this, and he's working on, when he presented what his work is, he went through his backpack, produced, I don't know, was it 4 volumes of Neil Stephenson? He said, this is what I'm doing my PhD on. And he said, here it is materially, and we just all said, okay. And so ever since then, we all have become, one way or another, acquainted with Neil Stephenson at the same time. So Moritz.
Thanks. Well, this is not about me. So one thing that I found really interesting about your talk is that a lot of the intersections of science and literature and in fact media are happening now. I mean, you come from a background of science and technology studies, or that's your department. And now Trent has a new media studies department, and that's find it especially interesting that you started with light, right? And especially special relativity, which in fact I understand as almost the start of modern physics as a media problem, right? Because light, it started off as a message without a medium in that sense, right? And then if we end up at McLuhan, he starts off media studies as light being the medium without a message. So kind of, and maybe you can address that at some point. What's the relationship between media studies, science and technology studies? How do those intersections work for you, and what do you see in that? But you don't have to do that now.
Okay.
If you want to, you can. Otherwise, I'll give the microphone over to whoever has a question, and I would ask you guys to briefly introduce yourself. Say who you are. Is that it? Was that a hand? No. Okay. All right, Liam.
Thanks, Moritz. I'm Liam Mitchell, Cultural Studies and Media Studies. So this is really poorly formed, but I really like the tenor of the presentation and the direction that you pushed it in. And it seemed, I don't know Gerald Feinberg at all, and I don't know very many of the people that you've addressed, but I've rubbed up against Hans Moravec and those other futurists. And I guess the question is one about the tone of the way that they write, that Feinberg or Feinberg?
Feinberg.
Feinberg, yeah. The way that Feinberg writes and the political implications of what they're doing. Because the way that you describe it, this kind of almost ressentiment for the body and for finitude, not just for death, but for the fact of just being bound in this one place, and then the desire to move from the future back towards the present to close it off, is a kind of like ontological totalitarianism. It's really extreme. But I'm wondering about the extent to which they realize that, because it seems like Kurzweil kind of gets it, right? Like he sort of knows what he's doing, at least in my vague impression of him. Did Feinberg do most of the futurists? Do they know that what they're doing has this kind of tone? Are they apologetic for it? And so on.
Yeah, thanks. Some of them are and some aren't. And in Feinberg's case, he definitely was. So there's numerous efforts that he makes in the Prometheus Project book to try to suggest that the model that he's presenting for this project, which will enable us to evaluate the possible long-range futures, pick our goals, mobilize all of the planet societies to achieving those goals, the effect will be to make us realize that we can't wait till the future to change, we must change now. That whole process, he realizes that it looks something like Blish's event police, and so he goes to great effort throughout the book to say, really, I don't think this is going to curtail individual freedom in any way. We have to realize that there's always the risk for having a kind of totalitarianism when we set long-term goals, but he believes if we have enough diversity, enough consensus meetings, enough deliberations, public fora, public engagement exercises, that eventually, if everybody participates, we will have just a good consensus meeting and everybody will be happy with it, and so that it will not end up feeling coercive. And so he then goes on to say, but we don't know that it might, whether future generations then might feel coerced by what people in the past had decided. And so he realizes that this is a problem. He says, we also don't know to what degree we're going to be able to convince the future to continue to take on our long-term goals unless we have made the case so strongly in the past and set things up in such a way that they will just sort of receive the naturalness and the value of the goal. They will also be convinced of it. But he says there's always going to be the possibility that different people are going to want to do different things, and he doesn't feel that these long-term goals are ultimately going to require that everybody go along with it. But he's obviously feeling anxious around exactly this question, because he's both wanting to say the entire human population is inevitably going to be changed by the very process of trying to set these long-term goals, and then also wanting to say, but it's not going to affect any individual's fate whatsoever. He knows it's a bit of a problem, but I think it concedes the suggestion that you're making. I think he struggles with it because he wants to not only cop out and suggest that maybe it won't be quite as totalitarian as it seems, but he also wants to, that's why he does some of these strange temporal maneuvers to suggest that we're even in setting our goals, we don't know really what they're going to mean in the future. So the best we do now is set them, and then that turns out not to be an end. We don't achieve the goal and therefore it's an end, but rather it turns out just to be the beginning of something that we can't even imagine. So he tries to turn it into an openness of flourishing rather than a closing off. I think it's undecidable which one it is, in the same way that in his own tachyon receptor model, you can't decide whether the tachyon is traveling backwards or forwards in time. I think ultimately he can't decide whether it's an entrapment and a closure of the future or whether it's this open space of potentiality. He kind of wants it to be both at the same time. And I think it's an effect of this science fictional proleptic way of thinking that he's struggling with it so much. And it's similar when we think of somebody like Kurzweil, Drexler, et cetera. They're all doing a similar type of struggle within the space that's entailed by their own theoretical program. They recognize that they're mapping out the future in such a way that it's dictating the possibilities that are available to us in the present, and yet wanting that to be about liberation and opportunity rather than foreclosure. And I think that's why we see the acrobatics around temporal logics. They're struggling to articulate a way of thinking about temporality and causality that is not conventional for normal linear humanist historical thinking. It's more similar to what science fiction novels do. But like many science fiction novels in an apocalypse, we also might have a similar risk with these kind of futurological projects.
I'm Hillary. I am a third-year philosophy and English major. I had the pleasure of taking Veronica Hollinger's science fiction course last year, and we read the novel Chronoliths. I feel like you basically answered my half question, half comment with the last answer, but I'm going to go for it anyways.
Okay.
In this novel, for those unfamiliar, a future war dictator sends these monoliths into the past, commemorating future war victories. And the people in the present, when those are created, begin to accept his inevitable dictatorship and act as though it's already happening. So my question was much the same as Liam Mitchell's, kind of saying, in that context, that political context, like, what are the problems created with that kind of singular version of the future being created by the actions of the people in the present?
Yeah, and I think this for somebody like Feinberg, and again, I think it's very characteristic of a whole range of other technoscientific futurologists that they do this. They often end up suggesting we're going to look at a variety of possible futures. None of them, even though we're talking about trying to set them in advance, none of them are actually going to be set in advance. Ultimately, as we move in time, things will start to sift out. They would suggest, we can imagine a number of bad, undesirable futures that we may think we're cruising right towards and that we're not going to be able to get out of it. But that the very exercise of contemplating that is the step that's needed in order to get us out of that, right? So by taking seriously the trajectory that we're on that's leading to a seemingly determined future, that creates the conditions for self-reflective perspicacity or something that then enables us to say, how do we change the directionality? And that's what that logic they fall back on a lot, which is why, for example, in a book like Engines of Creation, so Veronica mentioned, right, so this whole gray goo scenario that has haunted the history of nanotechnology for so long, Eric Drexler introduces that concept as one of the sort of apocalyptic doomsday scenarios that comes out of his thinking about nanotechnology, even though the purpose of that book is sort of to be completely celebratory and say we need to pursue nanotechnology, but he's got a lengthy chapter on all the horrific things that might happen. And so that often has been taken as the dominant message of his book, that he's imagining nano-catastrophe to emerge. Why does he have this chapter in there? I think it's because it's characteristic of the type of logic that says you must think about the worst possible consequences as well as the utopian ones in order to successfully navigate fields of possibility. I don't necessarily know that it's a method that clearly works. It's based upon this kind of fantasy of consensus and deliberation leading to best possible worlds that we see very strongly in somebody like Feinberg, but it's a common model.
My name is Dilyana, and I'm from the Cultural Studies Department. So I'm going to ask a question which I have to warn you is very naive and non-expert.
Yeah, no worries.
But it nonetheless draws on those relationships, very uncanny relationships between science and science fiction that you described in your talk. And I guess my couple of questions are around the ethical implications that are involved in those transitions. So the way you present it and the way those futurists interpret science fiction is as a Promethean kind of project. But it seems to me that they're making a structural misreading of those novels, because in a large amount of them, it is not about a Promethean future, but it's rather about a Faustian kind of future. Future in which the main character, at the risk and because of the passion that he wants to invent himself and his own world, ends up making a pact with the devil. So I think most of the science fiction, in a way, addresses this possible pact with the devil, this possible post-human condition as a catastrophe, not as a certain future or a future that has to be endorsed in a way. So I guess my first question is about whether there is some problematization of this kind of ethical moment in the literature in the projects that you presented. And my second question is related again to the work of imagination. So, what is your impression? Those people, those scientists who are so influenced by science fiction, they're obviously also influenced by imagination, by the workings of imagination. So I'm thinking, and they're influenced by this and passionate about this because they want to endorse this post-humanist condition, right? But at the same time, imagination, again in science fiction, works in extremely complicated ways. It is, I would say, also, even when it describes post-humanism, it could be inherently humanistic because it describes the ways in which the universe could be destroyed or changed or modified, but also imagination also provides the means by which universe could be turned into something better. So I'm just thinking, so my question here is whether the people you are interested in import imagination are they critical when they import imagination into their science projects?
Great, yeah, thanks. I think those two questions are quite related to each other in thinking about the role that science fiction plays for those scientists who not only read and enjoy, but it sort of explicitly try to think their scientific careers or their practices through the lens of science fiction. And I think it's complicated because we have hundreds of thousands of scientific practitioners around the world who have some engagement with modes of futuristic thinking, and some of them will very clearly take certain futuristic ideas, sometimes derived from science fiction, and latch on to the gizmo, the device, the technology, without looking at the context in which, say it's extracted from a science fiction story, the context in which that particular technology is represented, and then take it up as this is the goal we want to accomplish. What do we need to do? Resources to mobilize, knowledge to put together in order to produce this singular technology into the world, and as if then excising the rest of the science fiction narrative from which that thing came from in order to accomplish it. That happens a lot. That happens all over the place. Even corporations, some tech corporations have taken it as a practice to turn it into a mode of creating possible futures for corporate development. IBM, for example, has been doing this. Intel has been doing, they call it science fiction prototyping, where they read a bunch of, they have their engineers read a bunch of science fiction stories, sometimes write their own science fiction stories, but the purpose is to isolate a single technology that then maybe will help Intel think ahead into the future. So they take up these practices, but it's often only the singular novum that is at the heart of the science fiction story rather than the entirety of the story itself. On the other hand, then there's a bunch of other scientists who embrace and love science fiction and read it deeply and then see the value of the genre, not because it is a repository for all sorts of possible future goals, specific technologies or innovations, but rather because of the way that it narrates the social context, the ethical, philosophical dimensions that might be animated by the advent of a particular novum. And I think somebody like Gerald Feinberg was of the latter camp. He sees the value of the science fiction narratives that he reads for the way that they think about the social, political, philosophical, intellectual dimensions of any number of possible futures that might be produced from contemporary science and technology. He wants to focus on a set of ideas that might be good, but he also wants to be very attentive to even dystopian science fiction works that may suggest that pursuing certain agendas is going to lead us into very bad directions, but not because he thinks it can just simply be polarized between here's positive futures in science fiction, here are negative futures in science fiction, but rather the genre itself for him is doing a type of intellectual critical work that's always analyzing the possibility space of futurity given the advent of some irreversible change, which he called. Like, this is why he's so interested in the Prometheus project, about the possibility that some technology, some event, some decision in the present is going to lock us into a particular pathway that we may, as a society, be powerless to change. And he points to actually known examples of this kind of thing that happens. You know, economists, sociologists will call this lock-in or some, you know, these kind of phenomena. So he's concerned about that, and he feels by reading science fiction or thinking science fictionally, it gives us an intellectual disposition, an orientation towards these problems that ask us to self-reflect on positive, negative, or other consequences that might derive by positioning ourselves in a future looking backwards onto the present. So for him, it's fundamentally a critical practice. He ends up endorsing, you know, he goes through this long, logical, deductive process where he ends up endorsing the necessity to posthumanize ourselves precisely because he has been thinking that science fiction critically leads us to that. But he also says others may disagree with him. And I think that's his point too, that the space of speculative thought represented in the genre of science fiction is also one in which lots of possible forms of futuring take place, and lots of debate can happen of that nature. So he wants it to be a space of imagination that is critical of the way you're concerned. But I think he is, in some regards, he's kind of a minority. There's a set of futurists who very much think about the value of science fiction for its critical reflective capacities, and there are others who just want to mine it for ideas. I was actually at a workshop last year that was run by NASA, and it was focused on so, you know, the US space program is floundering, and so NASA wants to figure out how can it sort of rejuvenate itself into the future. And the idea that they had for this workshop, and they hand-invited some particular people to come in for it, was, can they data mine the history of science fiction in order to figure out overlooked directions that NASA research might go in the future? And they very much wanted to take the process of plucking ideas, inventions out of science fiction and discarding the plots. And I said to them over and over again, I said, why would you do this? I mean, that's not even, science fiction isn't even necessarily the best generator for possible inventions. Obviously, many good ideas for inventions come out of it, but it's not necessarily the primary cognitive function of that genre. It's its contextualization in an elaborate narrative framework that makes it important. But that was like, they wouldn't hear it. They just thought science fiction is an engine for generating gadgets. And I think that's a very strong attitude.
Hi, Michael Eamon, occasional historian of science. I really enjoyed your talk, and I being the historian, I just want to know, historically, how was Feinberg received by the scientific community? Mm-hmm. So you've touched on it a bit, but clearly the book that you showed, the Prometheus Method, was a trade press publication, probably aimed more at humanists like myself who like to think about the possibilities of science, that converted, so to speak. So how was it received in the scientific community, and were those ideas, is it measurable what happened with those ideas?
So yes. So because he had a very strong reputation in the community of physicists as being an excellent theoretical physicist, and his reputation in that regard rode on the fact that he had mathematically predicted the existence of the mu neutrino, and then a decade after he had predicted it, its existence was proved by his colleagues at Columbia. They won the Nobel Prize for it. He didn't share in that. But the community sort of recognized that Feinberg had predicted it in advance. And so he was known, okay, he's very good physicist. And so when he started, not too much later, but started thinking about these larger sociopolitical projects that became the Prometheus Project, he started those by gathering groups of other scientists together to start thinking about these issues. And he saw the value of creating these sort of discussion groups focused on thinking about the future, and then he wanted to extrapolate this to all society. He points out in the book, we can't just have scientists doing this. In fact, they're maybe the worst people to be talking about this. We need to have broad-based democratic process. So it begins with his colleagues, expands to the general trade press idea of the Prometheus Project, but it's still in conversation among other physicists, so it does get reviewed in the scientific journals, it gets science, Nature reviews, et cetera. Now, in terms of the question of its measurable impact, I think zero. I think that's the answer. Zero impact in terms of actually enacting it. Because, I mean, his idea is basically we're going to convince every country in the world to send delegates to these think tank collectives, and eventually we're going to generate long-term goals that will convince everybody we need to start re-engineering our DNA like right now. Somehow, not everybody jumped right on the bandwagon for this. So it was a little bit, perhaps, but I don't think that was the point. I don't think he actually thought it was going to happen. I think he thought of it as kind of a science fictional thought experiment to get the conversation out there. And he did then continue to keep publishing on that topic for at least a decade afterwards. And it was in the reception of those ideas outside of the scientific community was significant. There's a lot of evidence that he was taken up, for example, by certain countercultural movements and other kinds of like deep green ecologists and various other progressive thinkers. How much it continued to resonate within the physics community or the scientific community is only to the degree that people were aware of Gerald Feinberg as this kind of interesting guy, excellent physicist who's also thinking these wacky science fiction ideas, and maybe he's sort of worth paying attention to because of that.
So there were rebellion societies around Feinberg, but he did have impact in other groups.
He did, and I mean, so David Kaiser is a historian of physics who wrote a really interesting book a couple years ago called How the Hippies Saved Physics, where he looked at the prevalence in the 60s and 70s of physicists who were willing to explore a lot of unconventional ideas that helped the development of certain forms of theoretical physics. And he includes Feinberg as one of these characters among many, many others. And so in that, I think there is a broader story to be told of the kind that Kaiser does along those lines, that it may even have been something that was really diffuse in the scientific community, such that it didn't need a specific program for it to be taken up because it was already disseminating lots of different places. Yeah.
Hi, Jeremy Liebert. So I know some of your recent work, because we were talking about this, is on video games. And so I'm wondering if there's any kind of parallel or not between the type of project that's described here and the type of project that's described by someone like Jane McGonigal, where because it seems like there's this kind of the same idea for kind of global unity, goodness, happiness, and yet instead of the focus on the idea, the focus is entirely on practice to the point where it's divorced from any type of future goal. Right, like that's the. So, I'm lobbing that out there, not knowing. Anyhow.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I would say structurally, yes, I think they're quite similar. I mean, so of course, McGonigal represents the Institute for the Future. So, although the method of this mass gamification process and alternate reality games that she advocates often seems to have a result of kind of stripping away of futurity and focusing on practice. At the same time, some of the projects that she's worked on are very much about future analysis. So, World Without Oil, for example, is asking us to think about oil futures and petroculture. So there is a sense in which those type of games that the Institute for the Future and McGonigal in particular have worked on are like the consensus building exercises that Feinberg proposes, but getting together not through sitting around on a seminar table, but rather getting people to play together as a way of creating the future through affect and engagement rather than intellective deliberation. So it's at that level where they depart. Feinberg does not imagine that we will just play games and solve the problems of the future. He very much thinks it's only going to happen by rigorous, scientifically informed, robust philosophical discussion. And that could be, so McGonigal has kind of gone all out to say that hasn't worked, and so here's another model. Here's games. I
think in my mind that's kind of McGonigal's trick, is that people will play and have no idea that they're fixing the world as they go about doing it.
Yeah. So I think it's an experiment of the analogous. I think you're absolutely right. It's analogous to the kind of experiment that Feinberg proposes, very different in its implementation, and also has yet to be implemented in the wide scale.
Hi, I'm Sylvie Bérard. I'm in French Studies and Modern Languages and Literatures, and I work on science fiction. I was tremendously happy to hear you talk about Golden Age science fiction that we don't hear enough of anymore, and I think those texts are worth visiting again, and they bring back good memories as well. So I have a question. I don't know if anyway. So I was also super happy to see that you were mentioning the as if. I usually work with the what if, which is quite different, and I like, the what if saying that. In fact, science has always been about fiction, because it's always the idea that you have the scientists sitting and waiting for a discovery to happen is only a view of the imagination, and actually it's someone sitting and thinking, what if something happens, and trying to make it happen. So the as if is very interesting because it's already a narrative. So what was so the fiction you mentioned are about quite positivist futures. Golden Age is not very always optimistic, but there's some positivity. And I was thinking how it works with more ambiguous futures. How because I work with in a parallel life, I work with a research group on science fiction as a tool of social perspective. And it's a multidisciplinary group, and the literary people of the group always say, but wait, science fiction is not futurology, it's a perspective on things. So I was wondering if, how it works with ambiguous futures, and since it's a perspective, why aren't we back to humanism again?
So let's see, a couple of responses. So, and I'll try to tie it into the issue of the as if. So, for one thing, I agree with you about the stereotype of Golden Age science fiction, that it tends to be positive or optimistic compared to what comes later. I'm not sure, rereading a lot of Golden Age science fiction over the last several years, I'm not really sure it's as generally optimistic as it is remembered to be. In fact, there's quite a lot of dystopian, apocalyptic scenarios everywhere in Golden Age science fiction. Even in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame anthology, which kind of collects the Golden Age, a lot of those stories are really bleak and about sort of the reproduction of existing problems, structural problems into the future. So I'm not entirely sure about that. And if we think of even an example like Childhood's End, it's deeply ambiguous on this issue. So yes, it's about post-humanization and kind of a transcendence, but it's for a tiny, tiny, tiny little subgroup of the post-humans who have evolved in the course of the narrative, who are now going to become kind of coextensive with the structures of the universe, and the rest of humanity has died. It's completely wiped out, and then planet Earth itself is destroyed. So if that's the positive image that we're getting from Golden Age science fiction, what does it mean that that's the positive image? And so then that may be your question as to why don't we get back to humanism? Why is it that if indeed post-humanism, in its most optimistic form, will often end up looking from some perspective like complete catastrophe, wouldn't humanism be the alternative? And certainly we see a lot of humanist responses in Golden Age science fiction and after, which is to say a lot of science fiction is deeply humanist in its orientation, or at least it's the dominant viewpoints that are presented in it. But what may be the case is that those dominant humanist viewpoints don't necessarily sufficiently address the conditions of otherness or alterity that are animated by the story itself. I mean, one would be tempted to close read here, but I think very often we see the failures of humanism to distinguish itself from things like oppressive, totalitarian, racist, sexism, etc., in a lot of those stories, such that the post-human, even in its apocalyptic form, comes to seem optimistic in comparison to all the crimes that had been perpetuated in the name of the human against its own species and others. So that's, I think, why we don't see humanism in these posthumanist articulations as the answer. I also think, in some ways, the structure, what I've been trying to argue here, is that the formal structure of science fiction and its temporal dislocations often ends up creating a perspective on the human itself that isn't quite humanist, and that even when we have logics that are identifiably humanist in the plotting of the story, the way that the temporal logic of the narrative itself works at a formal level is often contrasting and potentially critiquing those same humanist perspectives. So I realize that went a little bit far afield of exactly what you were asking, but that's where then we would get to your initial point about the as-if at the level of scientific experimentation. So of course, as you pointed out, the hypothesis, the moment of hypothesis, any scientific experiment requires some kind of hypothesis, even if held provisionally. So there has to be a kind of necessary as-if. To carry out the experiment, one must take, at least for a little while going into it, to be the case that we are working as if the hypothesis were true. We are going to be able to falsify or continue on with the experiment based upon the execution of the experiment, but we're entertaining this as if scenario. I think that is a very similar kind of logic operative there. And to the degree that it depends, however, on a kind of separation of the observer and the observed, the subject and the object, that relationship to its as-if future is one that is very much a kind of conventional logocentric humanist perspective. But there are other modes in scientific experimentation and theorizing, for example, those coming out often of observer effect understandings in Copenhagen interpretations of quantum mechanics, that would want to undermine precisely that specific relationship between observer and observed and offer what, for example, the philosopher of science Karen Barad has called a posthumanist science, precisely at that level of hypothesis generation, because it disturbs the relationship of subject and object, which is to say, like in science fiction, we may have internal contradictions at the level of experimentation. Had to think through that a bit, so sorry if that wasn't entirely coherent there.
Well, I like the fact, maybe if I can add something, I like the fact that with your last comment, you kind of went into a science fictional, almost a mode, or science fiction as a form, and not so much as a motif in science. So with the observer effect, that's a structural, it's a structure. Right, and it's not so much about the motif. I mean, does science think about speculative new futures? But science itself runs against walls when it comes to creating metaphors or trying to observe things that it can in fact observe. Right? And maybe if we go vice versa, I was wondering what do you think of the fact that in literature we can observe, let's take the observer effect in quantum mechanics, right? It has, of course, found ways into literature that are not specifically science fiction literary works, right? I mean, postmodern literature takes up things like the observer effect, or the Heisenberg's uncertainty or something, just in terms of a hermeneutic problem, right? Or the problem of interpretation, or the an inherent ambiguity. Right, that I read as science fictional in a sense, or as scientific, right? Yes. So I was wondering, how do you see the kind of influx of science into other genres other than science fiction in that sense?
Well, in many of the experiments with literary form that sometimes had been characterized as postmodernist and may now go by some other name, if we can have a postmodern form of experimentalist literature, where we see them taking up these explicit references to modern physics is often, as you're suggesting, I think, a way of engaging with something that has already been endemic to the field of literature or representation or signification in general, which is the instability of a referent in any signifying system, that there is always an observer effect in communication, in semiotics and representation as such. And so to that extent, I think a lot of the fiction that wants to engage with that is just serving to allegorize the history of literary representation in its entirety. So one could go so far as to say, it's suggesting the way that literary reading has already anticipated modes of analysis that become characteristic of certain forms of modern physics, at least in the Copenhagen interpretation. And there have been debates on to what extent one can push that specific claim. But I think it is clear that literary writers have wanted to establish that analogy and run with it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, even earlier, right? I mean, we see in when the quantum Copenhagen interpretation came up, we had cubism, right?
Yes.
Or trying to engage very similar ruptures of perspective, or and sometimes it's not very clear if there's is that a causal relationship? Is that a clear feedback relationship, or is it just a matter of a similar paradigm emerging at the same time out of a certain zeitgeist that produces an anxiety about interpretation or observation in science as much as in, let's say, art or literature or anthropology, ethnography, right? I mean,
I think sometimes there are zeitgeist explanations that make sense of these things, although often on the micro level. So when I do a lot of the studies of looking at relations between science and literature, the laboratory level, the level of experiments, the level of individuals' biographies, close textual analysis, it often turns out to be that there are more intimate types of relations, but they're not clearly ones of influence. They're often more a type of appropriation. And so I think where we see works of art and scientific experiment seemingly resonating or expressing similar ideas, it's often because there has been either a direct or through some circuitous route, an effort to borrow or appropriate or transform a conceptual resource or formal resource from one domain into another. And it often isn't remotely the same when that appropriation happens. It produces a difference, and a difference that matters. I think that's important, that art doesn't, cubism, et cetera, doesn't just become quantum physics, right? Nor that quantum physics, to whatever degree it may have literary borrowings, quirks, and the history of particle physics has a number of instances like that, that it isn't just simply reproducing some other form of culture, but it's producing something new in these circumstantial and haphazard borrowings that take place. So processes of modification, I think we need to pay attention to.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jonathan Bordeaux. I just really loved your talk, and it's full of so many ideas, so many things that came to mind, brought things up that I didn't quite even know where to begin actually asking a question. So I have I'll just set up a worksheet with a couple of very small references. Worksheet 1, the MIT historian of science, Giorgio de Santayana, and specifically I'm concerned with The Crime of Galileo, that specific text. I don't know if you're familiar with it. So that's 1. 2, just a very basic proposition which de Santayana allows one to reflect on, which is modern foundationalist metaphysics came to replace the possibility of scientific education, which is something that he said, instead of our getting with Galileo scientific education as a result of these disputes, we got foundationalist metaphysics instead, with the consequence that the reality question itself, the whole question of reality, came to be something which came to be elevated as something metaphysical or philosophical, or if you want, it comes to be a question having to do with fiction. And so when we go back to Galileo, Descartes, we're dealing with the way fiction and hypothesis come to be, in fact, in some sense, identical, right? So that's on the top. So what I wanted to ask you is, it's kind of like that interstice between science and science fiction. And so one thing is, and I like the way you put it to Moritz, it's like well, is it influence or is it appropriation? But what we do is we kind of close the gap, as if we really could just close this thing, that somewhere along the line they become, one flows into the other, when in fact they belong to completely radically different regimes, not just of discourse, but of practice itself. And so it's kind of, I've just kind of noticed that at a certain moment when we cross over a line where people do this work, they make reference or they give themselves credentials with respect to science as a way of entering into narrative itself. And so we can't see what the suture is anymore between them, all right? And so my question then is, to what extent are we still just reenacting, you know, that foundationalist moment of the 17th century where we got cheated in some way. We just never got scientific education. And so what we have is, I'm sorry, I've got to close that off. So what we have instead is that gap between what we think is theory, but it's really an inverted kind of practice. And we have a practice which wants to be theoretical on the other side. So theory has always gone about denying that it actually was a practice. And on the other hand, we have what is a pragmatic discourse about action, activity, science fiction, which casts itself, in fact, as speculation. That's what I...
Yeah, so my sense is that the separation between practice and theory and debates about foundationalism are themselves based upon a kind of spurious division between material and enacted materialism and a kind of transcendent space of thought. It's a Cartesianism of sorts. And I would want to suggest that we have practice all the way down. So all of these forms of practice, as you say, theory denied the extent to which it was practice. To understand the relations of all of these different fields in their differences, we have to take seriously that they are all practices that produce themselves in various ways. And they may strive to produce themselves as theoretical discourses or representational or fictive discourses or experimentalist discourses, but they can only do so to the extent that they play out in time, in the world, as the interactions of a group of actors, humans and non-humans, to draw sort of STS actor network theory, thinking that we never get beyond the sense of dynamic productivity in which practices are there producing themselves and reproducing themselves. So in those terms, I don't know that we would have a question of were we cheated of a scientific education if we think that science is as science does. Science as practice would suggest that science has changed through time to the extent that it has developed its practices differentially through time. There is no science beyond its actual existence in history. So we may wish for a different science, but not one that has already been possible, that we simply were not paying attention to, one that we could potentially produce as another set of practices. But it bears more thinking.
I guess I guess my question was always directed toward, we are still completely entangled in codes. And what I just tried to very quickly outline was just the dominance of codes that in fact we have actually not transcended. And it's within those codes that these discourses actually are cycling themselves.
Yes, no, I absolutely agree with that. Yeah, I think disciplines, social orders, et cetera, reproduce themselves by reproducing their structural codes over and over again into the future, and that there's a strong determining force to codes, genres, discursive forms of various kinds. And yeah, to break out of form is very difficult. It's almost unimaginable.
Michel Serre. And see, so Serre comes to actually be a thinker who tries to establish a place of mediation with respect to those codes themselves. Somehow, isn't science
Yeah.
fiction. It's some other term of reference, which is the mediator discourse between science and science fiction. And in some sense, as if we lack it. And that I take to be, the really significant contribution of Michel Serres as a scientific cultural theorist, because it's about that mediating role in that gap.
Yeah.
That his work, in fact, takes place.
Yes, although it's not necessarily to find a mediation that could be a meta-language that would somehow repair the gap between the two. It's rather to always recognize that that gap is internal to these discourses, that noise and other parasites are always going to be manifested by the systems themselves. They're going to produce their own gaps and externalities. So I don't think we end up in a position where we can simply find the solution by producing a meta-language that will then make everything intelligible to itself.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking as a meta. I was thinking as a mediating one. That was just the mediator between them off as a meta language. That's what I was trying to suggest. Maybe Morris as a comment.
All right. Thanks again, Colin Milburn, for a great talk.
Thank you all. Thank you all. Good questions. Thank you.